She never told him. Not once. Not when he first started treating her like an inconvenience. Not when his mistress began appearing at events that used to be theirs. Not when his father started tightening financial controls around her accounts. She never told him that the $800 billion fashion dynasty his mistress had been desperate to model for, the empire that defined luxury on 5 continents, that made or ended careers with a single casting decision, was hers. Built with her hands, sealed under her name in documents he had never thought to read. She was his wife, and to him, that was all she was. So when his father froze her bank cards the morning of Fashion Week, the single most important runway event of the year, and he walked up to her reserved VIP seat and handed it to his mistress with a smile that told the whole room exactly how little she mattered, she did not argue. She did not expose him. She simply stepped back because she already knew what was coming. She had made one phone call the night before. One call to the CEO of the dynasty. Her CEO, her appointment, her most loyal executive. And she had said 4 words. Let them see everything. The convoy of Rolls-Royces arrived precisely on schedule. 12 vehicles. Every one of them bearing the insignia of the fashion dynasty his mistress had failed to enter for 3 consecutive years. The CEO stepped out and crossed the entire Fashion Week carpet. Past designers, unpast celebrities, past the mistress frozen mid-pose, and bowed to the woman with the frozen bank cards and the stolen seat. He cried, and then he was destroyed. Not by anger, not by revenge, but by the simple, unstoppable weight of truth. But the question that will stay with you is not what she did. It is why she waited. And what that kind of patience, that kind of power, costs a woman on the inside. Dear viewers, this story is about the extraordinary cost of underestimating a woman who chose silence over performance. And the breathtaking moment when that silence finally ends. You will learn that true power needs no announcement, that arrogance always builds the very stage on which it is destroyed, and that patience, loyalty, and quiet excellence are the rarest and most powerful forms of strength any person can carry. As this story unfolds, ask yourself honestly, what would you have done in her place? Drop your answer and every lesson you learned in the comments. I read every single one. And if this story moved you, subscribe now for more powerful, life-changing stories exactly like this. Scene 1. The morning they thought they won. 800 words. The call came at 6:47 in the morning. Eleanor Whitfield heard it. The soft, precise ping of her phone on the marble nightstand. And she already knew what it meant before she touched the screen. She had been awake for 40 minutes by then, sitting at the edge of the bed in the gray, pre-dawn stillness of a Manhattan penthouse that had her name on the deed but increasingly felt like a place she was merely permitted to occupy. She picked up the phone, read the notification, and set it back down with the same stillness with which she had picked it up. Every bank card linked to her personal accounts had been frozen, effective immediately. Authorized by one name, Gerald Whitfield Sr., her father-in-law. She sat with that for a moment, not with panic, not with tears, but with the quiet, almost clinical recognition of a woman who had seen this move coming for 3 weeks and had already built the response before the attack arrived. Gerald Sr. was a precise man, methodical. He had spent 40 years constructing a real estate empire by eliminating variables, and that was exactly what he believed Eleanor to be, a variable in his son's life that had outlived its usefulness. He had done this before, to the woman before her. That woman had crumbled within 72 hours. But Eleanor was not that woman. But Eleanor had never been that woman. She rose from the bed, crossed to the window, and looked out over a city that did not yet know what this day would become. 31 floors below, Manhattan was beginning its slow morning exhale. Delivery trucks, early joggers, the first yellow cabs cutting through streets still damp from last night's rain. Somewhere across town, in a hotel suite she had paid for without Gerald Sr. ever knowing, 12 Rolls-Royces were being detailed and aligned. Somewhere across that same town, in a corner office on the 44th floor of a building whose ownership traced back through 4 holding companies to a single woman's signature, her CEO, Raymond Cole, was already awake, already dressed, already waiting for the instruction she had given him the night before in 4 words. Let them see everything. She had said it calmly, Raymond had paused for exactly 2 seconds, the pause of a man absorbing the magnitude of what was being authorized, and then said, "Yes, ma'am," with the gravity of someone who understood that what she was setting in motion could not be undone. She had not wanted it undone. She had wanted it witnessed. But let us go back, because to understand what Eleanor was about to do, you had to understand what Eleanor had endured. And to understand what she had endured, you had to go back 11 years, to a woman of 26 who had walked into a struggling textile manufacturer's boardroom in Charlotte, North Carolina, with a leather portfolio, a 5-year restructuring plan, and the kind of quiet confidence that made older men in expensive suits deeply, inexplicably uncomfortable. She had not inherited the Whitfield Fashion Group. She had built it from a $4 million failing manufacturer with 16 employees and 3 defaulted contracts into the $800 billion dynasty that now dressed heads of state, anchored Fashion Week on 4 continents, and made its CEO one of the 20 most photographed executives in the world. She had done it through 17-hour days, through decisions that terrified her board but proved prescient within 18 months, through the kind of visionary architecture that business schools would one day teach in case studies. But she had done it quietly, deliberately, invisibly, because Eleanor Whitfield had understood something at 26 that most people never learn. The world moves differently around a woman it cannot categorize. So she had structured the dynasty under holding entities, or he had kept her name in the ownership documents but off the public-facing mastheads, had let Raymond Cole be the face while she remained the mind. It was a strategy, a deliberate, elegant, long-horizon strategy. It was also the strategy her husband had mistaken for smallness. She had met Donovan Whitfield 3 years into building the empire, at a charity gala where he had been charming and attentive, and entirely unaware that the woman he was pursuing controlled more capital than his father's entire portfolio. She had not told him. She had wanted just once to be chosen for herself. And Donovan had chosen her. Or so it had seemed. But somewhere in the years that followed, the choosing had quietly become something else. Something that looked less like love and more like management. The mistress, Camille Dorset, had entered the picture 18 months ago. Eleanor had known within 3 weeks. She had said nothing then either, but not from weakness, from calculation. She crossed back to the nightstand now, picked up her phone again, and opened the message from Raymond. 2 words. Already. Eleanor Whitfield set the phone down, walked to her wardrobe, and began to dress for Fashion Week. Slowly, deliberately, in the quietly devastating way that a woman dresses when she already knows exactly how the day ends. But here is what Donovan Whitfield was doing at that exact same moment, and what Camille had already been promised. That would make what came next completely, irreversibly inevitable. Donovan Whitfield had been rehearsing the moment in his mind since the night before. He stood in the marble lobby of the Meridian Grand, Fashion Week's most prestigious venue, the kind of building where the air itself seemed to understand the value of appearances, adjusting the lapels of his charcoal Brioni suit with the practiced ease of a man who had spent his entire life believing that confidence and entitlement were the same thing. Beside him, Camille Dorset stood in a floor-length ivory gown that she had spent 6 weeks selecting, her portfolio clutched against her side like a weapon she had been sharpening for 3 years. 3 years of auditions for the Whitfield Fashion Group. 3 years of rejection letters that arrived with the cold efficiency of a system that did not explain itself. Our 3 years of using Donovan's last name as a key in doors that kept, inexplicably, not opening. She had told herself it was industry politics. She had told herself it was jealousy. She had never once told herself the truth. That there was a woman at the center of that empire who did not need to issue instructions to protect her household, because the people who served that empire already understood what loyalty meant. But this morning, Camille believed today was different, because Donovan had promised her the VIP seat, not just any seat, Eleanor's seat. The front row reservation that bore the Whitfield name, that placed its occupant directly in the eye line of every camera, every designer, every industry contact who mattered. Donovan had framed it as a gift. In reality, it was a statement, the kind of statement men make when they have confused their wife's patience for permanent surrender. Eleanor arrived at the Meridian Grand at precisely 9:14 a.m. She wore midnight blue, A structured architectural dress that moved with her like it had been designed specifically for this morning, which, in fact, it had been. No jewelry except a single ring on her right hand, a detail that meant nothing to anyone in that lobby, but would mean everything before the day was over. She carried nothing. No portfolio, no clutch, no armor of any visible kind. She walked through the entrance the way water moves, without force, without announcement, but with the absolute certainty of something that cannot be stopped. Donovan saw her first. Something flickered across his face, too fast to name, and gone before it could be examined. Then Camille touched his arm, and whatever had flickered was replaced by the expression he had been rehearsing. Deliberate, almost theatrical in its casualness. He walked toward Eleanor with his hands in his pockets. "You won't be needing the seat today," he said. Not a question, not an apology. A declaration, delivered at a volume that was precisely calibrated, loud enough for the cluster of photographers and industry journalists nearby to absorb, quiet enough to deny later if necessary. Eleanor looked at him. Just looked. The way she had always looked at him in these moments, with eyes that saw further than he was comfortable with, that held something unreadable, something that had always made him feel, beneath his confidence, faintly exposed. Camille has a meeting with the casting director," he continued, his voice finding its rhythm now, the rhythm of a man who had mistaken her silence for the absence of power. "She needs the visibility. You understand." He reached past her, past his wife, past 11 years of marriage, past every unspoken agreement that had kept this household intact, and lifted the VIP seat card from the reservation stand at the entrance. He turned. He pressed it into Camille's hand. And he smiled. The cameras caught it. Every single one. But here is what those cameras did not catch. What no one in that lobby was positioned to see. The almost imperceptible curve of Eleanor's mouth in the moment after Donovan turned away. Not a smile of amusement. Not a smile of pain. A smile of the precise, controlled variety that belongs to someone watching the final piece of a very long plan settle exactly into place. She had needed him to do it publicly. She had needed the cameras. She had needed the witnesses. Because what was coming in 47 minutes required a before, a documented, photographed, witnessed before, so that the after would be permanently, undeniably understood. She stepped back from the entrance. She found a position near the east wall of the lobby. Not hidden, not prominent, simply present. And she waited. Let us pause here, because before the convoy of Rolls-Royces arrives, you need to understand something about Eleanor Whitfield that Donovan had stopped trying to understand years ago. There had been a night, 7 years into their marriage, 2 years before Camille, when Eleanor had come home from a board meeting at 1 a.m. to find Donovan in the kitchen, awake, irritable, already 3 glasses into a bottle of scotch. She had set her bag down and asked him what was wrong. He had looked at her. Looked at this woman who had spent 14 hours restructuring a $200 billion acquisition that would later be cited in the Financial Times as one of the decade's most elegant corporate maneuvers, and said, with the flat certainty of a man who had never questioned his own perspective, "I just don't think you take our life seriously enough, Eleanor. You're always somewhere else. You're never really here." She had stood in that kitchen for a long moment. She had thought about telling him, about the acquisition, about the board, about the architectural precision with which she was building something that would outlast both of them. She had opened her mouth. And then she had closed it. Because she had looked at his face and understood, with the clarity of a woman who reads rooms the way other people read words, that he did not want to know. That knowing would require him to restructure every assumption he had built their marriage on. That some people, when faced with a truth that complicates their comfort, will choose the simpler story every single time. So she had said, "You're right. I'll do better." And she had gone to bed, and she had never raised it again. That memory was what she stood with now, against the east wall of the Meridian Grand, watching Camille settle into her seat with the visible satisfaction of a woman who believed she had won something. She had not won anything. She had simply arrived at the moment Eleanor had designed. Eleanor checked her watch. 43 minutes. She looked toward the entrance of the Meridian Grand, toward the wide, glass-fronted doors that opened onto the street, where, in 43 minutes, 12 Rolls-Royces bearing the insignia of the Whitfield Fashion Group would arrive. Where Raymond Cole would step out. Where everything Gerald Sr. had frozen, everything Donovan had dismissed, everything Camille had coveted, would be returned to its rightful owner in the most public, the most permanent, the most witnessed way imaginable. But Donovan was laughing now. Laughing at something Camille had said, laughing in the easy, unguarded way of a man who believed the hardest part of his morning was already behind him. And he had no idea the hardest part had not yet begun. But what was happening outside those doors at that exact moment, and what Raymond Cole was carrying in the document folder pressed under his arm, would ensure that nothing inside that building, or inside that marriage, or inside Camille Dorset's career, would ever be the same again. They heard them before they saw them. Not engines. The Rolls-Royces of the Whitfield Fashion Group were too precisely engineered for anything as crude as noise. What the people inside the Meridian Grand heard first was something subtler. A shift in the atmosphere outside the glass doors, a change in the quality of the light as 12 identical vehicles turned onto the boulevard in perfect formation, their silver insignia catching the morning sun with the quiet, absolute authority of things that had never needed to announce themselves. Then the doors opened, and the world outside became visible. 12 Rolls-Royces, midnight blue, the precise shade of Eleanor's dress. Bearing the crest of the Whitfield Fashion Group on every door panel, the crest that had graced the covers of Vogue, Harper's Bazaar, and WWD across 4 decades, are the crest that Camille Dorset had spent 3 years trying to earn the right to stand beneath. They were arranged not in a line but in a deliberate arc, a formation that any military strategist would have recognized as one designed not for transport but for arrival, for maximum witness, for theater of the most precise and intentional kind. The lobby of the Meridian Grand went quiet. Not gradually, immediately. The way sound stops when something enters a room that recalibrates every calculation every person in that room has been making. Donovan felt it first as confusion. He turned from Camille, from whatever easy, comfortable conversation had been cushioning his morning, and looked toward the doors with the furrowed expression of a man encountering a variable he had not budgeted for. He recognized the crest. Nay, of course he recognized it. It was one of the most recognizable insignias in global fashion, the kind of symbol that appeared in the background of photographs he had seen his entire adult life. But he had no framework for why it was here, why 12 vehicles bearing it had formed an arc outside the most prestigious Fashion Week venue in the country, and why every photographer in the lobby had abandoned whatever they had been photographing and was now pressed against the glass like children at an aquarium. He looked at Camille. She was already standing, already moving toward the doors with the instinctive, almost animal urgency of someone who had spent 3 years chasing exactly this proximity. Her portfolio was clutched against her chest. Her eyes were bright with the specific brightness of a woman who had decided this was her moment. She had no idea. Raymond Cole stepped out of the first vehicle. He was 61 years old, silver-haired, and dressed in the understated, architectural precision that had made him one of the most photographed executives in global fashion. But he was not dressed for a runway today. He was dressed for something more formal, more final. The document folder under his arm was cognac leather, embossed with the Whitfield crest, the kind of folder that only appeared at signings, at announcements, at moments that were being permanently recorded. He did not look at the photographers. He did not look at the designers gathered near the entrance. He did not look at Camille Dorset, who had positioned herself directly in his path with the desperate, visible hope of a woman making her last audition. He looked for Eleanor, and it took him 4 seconds to find her, standing against the east wall exactly where she had been standing for the last 40 minutes, in her midnight blue dress with her single ring, with the stillness of someone who had been waiting not with anxiety, but with the patience of absolute certainty. When his eyes found hers, something passed between them. The wordless communication of 2 people who had built something extraordinary together and were now watching it finally, publicly, claim its place in the light. Raymond Cole crossed the lobby. He walked past the photographers, past the designers, past Camille, who turned to follow his trajectory with growing, dawning confusion, whose portfolio lowered by degrees as she watched the CEO of the Whitfield Fashion Group move through the crowd not toward the runway, not toward the front row, or not toward any of the industry titans whose names filled the VIP list, but toward the east wall. Toward the woman standing quietly against it. Toward the woman whose bank cards had been frozen that morning. Toward the woman whose seat had been taken. He stopped in front of Eleanor Whitfield. And he bowed. Not a nod. Not a handshake. Not the performative half-bow of corporate courtesy. A full, deliberate, unambiguous bow. The bow of a man acknowledging not a social superior but an institutional sovereign. The kind of deference that, in its very completeness, communicated to every witness in that lobby exactly what Eleanor Whitfield was and had always been. The cameras erupted. Every photographer in the Meridian Grand turned simultaneously, the sound of their shutters filling the lobby like sudden rain. Capturing Raymond Cole's bow, I'm capturing Eleanor's stillness, capturing the exact expression on the faces of everyone around her as the architecture of their assumptions about this woman collapsed in real time. But capturing, most devastatingly of all, the expression on Donovan Whitfield's face. He had gone pale. Not the pale of embarrassment. Not the pale of social discomfort. The deep, bloodless pale of a man watching the ground dissolve beneath a structure he had built his entire understanding of his life upon. His mouth had opened, slightly, involuntarily, in the way mouths open when the mind encounters something it has no existing category for and must rebuild its entire framework from the ground up. Camille had stopped moving entirely. She stood 6 feet from Raymond Cole's vehicles, her portfolio hanging from fingers that had forgotten to grip. Her eyes moving between Raymond's bowed figure and Eleanor's composed face with the frantic, recalculating urgency of someone trying to locate the moment they had fundamentally misread the room. And finding, with growing horror, that it had not been a moment. It had been years. Raymond straightened. He opened the cognac leather folder. He withdrew a single document. One page, the Whitfield crest at the top, Eleanor's signature at the bottom, and he turned so that it was visible to the photographers, to the journalists, to the industry witnesses who had spent this morning believing they were attending a fashion event and had instead been granted front-row seats to something that would be discussed in boardrooms and green rooms and glossy magazine profiles for the next decade. The document was the Whitfield Fashion Group's founding ownership certificate. Original, notarized, bearing one name in the owner's line. Eleanor Whitfield, not Gerald Whitfield Sr., not Donovan Whitfield, not a board, not a trust. One woman, one name. The name of the woman whose bank cards had been frozen at 6:47 that morning by a man who had never thought to read the documents that governed the empire he had been casually dismissing for 11 years. Raymond spoke then, clearly at a volume precisely calibrated for the room. "Mrs. Whitfield," he said, "the board has convened and ratified your full assumption of public leadership, effective today. The Whitfield Fashion Group is ready to receive its owner." The silence that followed was the kind that has weight. Eleanor reached out and accepted the folder. She held it the way she held everything, without performance, without theater, with the simple, grounded confidence of someone receiving what had always been theirs. She looked at it for a moment. Then she looked up. Not at Raymond, not at the cameras, but directly at Donovan. He was crying. Not the clean, cinematic crying of a man moved by beauty. The raw, undone crying of a man who had just watched every assumption he had ever made about his own life revealed as a scaffolding built on someone else's foundation. His face had the specific devastation of someone who was understanding, for the first time and far too late, that the woman he had spent years underestimating had been, the entire time, the most powerful person in every room they had ever shared. Camille had not moved. She was still standing 6 feet from the vehicles. But she was no longer the woman who had walked into the Meridian Grand that morning with a portfolio and a borrowed seat and a plan. That woman had been dismantled, quietly and completely, by the sight of 12 Rolls-Royces and 1 bow. But the morning was not over yet. Because Eleanor Whitfield had not said a single word, and what she was about to say, the only words she would speak in that lobby, the words she had been composing not for hours but for years, would ensure that when Donovan Whitfield left the Meridian Grand, he would leave not just humiliated, but permanently, irrevocably changed. What Eleanor said next. What Gerald Sr. discovered within the hour. And why Camille Dorset never modeled for the Whitfield Fashion Group, or anyone else in that tier, again. Eleanor Whitfield spoke 6 words. That was all. 6 words, delivered without elevation, without trembling, without the performance of anger or the theater of revenge, in the voice of a woman who had spent 11 years conserving exactly this moment for exactly this room. She looked at Donovan directly, with the same eyes that had looked at him across 1,000 dinners and 1,000 silences and one kitchen at 1 a.m., when she had chosen to close her mouth instead of open the truth, and she said, "I built this. You never looked." 6 words. But in that lobby, against the backdrop of 12 Rolls-Royces and Raymond Cole's bow and the founding ownership certificate now resting in her hands, those 6 words did not land like a sentence. They landed like a verdict. The kind that does not require an appeal because the evidence has already been entered, witnessed, and permanently recorded by every camera in the room. Donovan's mouth opened, closed, opened again. But there was nothing. No argument, no defense, no counter-narrative that could survive contact with the reality that had just been laid bare in front of every industry witness, every photographer, every journalist who had come to cover a runway and had instead been handed the story of the decade. He had no language for this moment. Because you cannot argue with the truth when the truth arrives in 12 midnight blue vehicles bearing the crest of an empire you never knew your wife owned. But let us go back one final time, because the full weight of those 6 words requires one more piece of history to land completely. 15 years ago, Eleanor Whitfield had not yet been Eleanor Whitfield. She had been Eleanor Voss, 24 years old, the daughter of a Charlotte textile worker who had died when she was 19, leaving her a small inheritance, a work ethic that bordered on the supernatural, and an absolute bone-deep understanding of what it meant to build something from nothing. She had taken that inheritance, $47,000, every dollar of it, and invested it into a failing textile manufacturer that everyone in the industry had written off as a casualty of overseas competition. Everyone except Eleanor. She had seen what they had not. Not a failing manufacturer, but a platform. An infrastructure. The bones of something that, with the right vision and the right architecture, could become the foundation of a global fashion empire. She had worked 17-hour days for 4 years before the company turned its first significant profit. She had made decisions that made her board uncomfortable, that made industry analysts write skeptical quarterly pieces, that made older men in expensive suits question whether she understood the market she was operating in. She had understood it better than all of them. By the time she met Donovan Whitfield at that charity gala, by the time she had smiled at his charm and his attention and his complete, comfortable obliviousness to who she was, the Whitfield Fashion Group was already valued at $340 billion and climbing. She had taken his last name when they married, had quietly applied it to the company as a structural decision, had let it become the public-facing identity of the empire while she remained, by deliberate design, on the invisible sovereign behind it. She had wanted to be chosen for herself. She had been. But what she had not anticipated, what no amount of business acumen had prepared her for, was the specific loneliness of being loved for a version of yourself that has been deliberately made smaller than the truth. Donovan had loved Eleanor Whitfield, the wife. He had never known Eleanor Voss, the architect. And somewhere in the years between the charity gala and the kitchen at 1 a.m., she had understood that he never would. Not because he was incapable of it, but because he had never tried. That was the thing that had hurt most. Not the arrogance, not the mistress, not even the frozen bank cards. The not trying. Raymond Cole stepped forward now, not to speak, but to hand Eleanor a second document from the cognac leather folder. This one was new, unprepared in the last 72 hours. Eleanor took it, reviewed it with the practiced speed of someone who reads legal architecture the way other people read menus, and then looked up at Donovan one final time. Gerald Sr. attempted to freeze personal accounts, she said, and her voice was calm in the way that deep water is calm, still on the surface, immeasurable beneath. But he froze the wrong accounts. The accounts he froze were the ones I set aside 11 years ago for exactly this contingency. She let that settle. Every primary account, every asset, every holding, every entity that constitutes the Whitfield Fashion Group operates under a legal structure that requires my sole authorization to access. Your father does not have that authorization. He never did. Neither do you. Donovan's legs appeared to lose their certainty, and he reached for the wall behind him. A small, involuntary gesture, the gesture of a man whose physical architecture is responding to the collapse of his internal one. Camille had moved further back, her portfolio now hanging at her side, like something she no longer understood the purpose of, her eyes fixed on Eleanor with an expression that had moved entirely beyond jealousy into something rawer and more honest. The expression of a woman finally seeing, clearly and completely, exactly what she had been competing against. And understanding for the first time that there had never been a competition, because you cannot compete with someone who was never threatened by you. Raymond turned to Camille then, the first time he had acknowledged her existence since stepping out of the vehicle, and spoke with the measured, final courtesy of a man closing a chapter. "Miss Dorset," he said, "the Whitfield Fashion Group casting department will be in touch regarding the conclusion of your application process." He paused for precisely the right beat. The decision was made some time ago. The communication was delayed at Mrs. Whitfield's discretion. Camille looked at Eleanor. Eleanor looked back. And in that look was not triumph, not cruelty, not even satisfaction, but something more complex and more devastating than any of those things. It was the look of a woman who had known, for 18 months, exactly what was happening in her marriage, who had chosen the timing of its conclusion with the same strategic precision she brought to every decision in her empire, and who felt, now that the moment had arrived, not joy but the particular, a bittersweet relief of a burden finally set down. She had not done this for revenge. She had done it because the morning his father froze her bank cards and her husband gave away her seat, she had understood that silence had completed its purpose. That the protection she had once afforded them, the invisibility she had maintained to give her marriage room to breathe, had been repaid with a contempt so public and so complete that continuing to protect them would have been a betrayal not of them, but of herself. Gerald Whitfield Sr. received the call at 10:23 a.m. It came not from Eleanor, not from Donovan, but from his own attorney, who had spent the previous 40 minutes reviewing the legal architecture of the Whitfield Fashion Group at Raymond Cole's request and had arrived at conclusions that required immediate communication. Yet the call lasted 4 minutes. Gerald Sr. did not speak for the last 3 of them. When he hung up, he sat in his office on the 32nd floor of his real estate tower and understood, with the cold, precise clarity of a man who had spent 40 years eliminating variables, that he had catastrophically, irreversibly misidentified the variable. He had frozen the bank cards of the woman who owned the most valuable fashion empire in the world. He had done it on the morning of her company's flagship event. He had done it in front of cameras. He had not destroyed Eleanor Whitfield. He had handed her the stage. By noon, the photographs were everywhere. Raymond Cole's bow, the founding certificate, the 12 midnight blue vehicles, Eleanor's face, composed, unreadable, our sovereign, above the headline that would define that fashion week and every conversation about it for years afterward. The story moved faster than any runway collection, faster than any designer reveal, faster than anything the Meridian Grand had hosted in its 40-year history. Because it was not a fashion story, it was a human story. The story of a woman who had built an $800 billion empire in deliberate silence, who had absorbed 11 years of diminishment without allowing it to touch the foundation she had constructed beneath her, and who had, when the moment was exactly right, not a day earlier, not an hour later, simply let the truth become visible. Donovan left the Meridian Grand alone. Camille had already gone, quickly, quietly, through a side exit, or in the way of someone who needs to be somewhere private to dismantle what they believed about themselves and begin the slow work of reconstruction. The cameras caught Donovan at the door, one photograph taken by a journalist who had simply been in the right place. That showed him in profile, his hand on the door handle, his face carrying the specific devastation of a man who was leaving a building as a fundamentally different person than the one who had entered it. He was not destroyed in the way that word usually means. He was not ruined financially, not imprisoned, not publicly condemned. He was destroyed in the way that matters more and lasts longer. The destruction of a false self-image, the collapse of a story a man has been telling himself about his own importance, his own power, his own indispensability. Eleanor had not needed to take anything from him. She had simply stopped pretending she needed him to give it. She stood at the entrance of the Meridian Grand as the last of the 12 Rolls-Royces pulled forward, the lead vehicle, hers, waiting with the quiet certainty of something that had always been ready. Raymond held the door. She paused before entering. Just for a moment, just long enough to look back at the building, at the lobby where the morning had unfolded, at the city that was already absorbing the story of what had happened here. She thought of her father, of the $47,000, of 17-hour days in Charlotte, and a board that had doubted her, and a kitchen at 1 a.m. and a mouth she had closed when she should have opened it. She thought of all of it, and then she let it go. Not with bitterness, with the clean, grounded release of a woman who has finally stopped carrying what was never hers to carry. Who has understood, at the cellular level, that her power had never required his acknowledgement to be real. That it had been real every single day, in every decision, in every document bearing her name, whether he had looked or not. She stepped into the vehicle. The door closed, the convoy moved, and Eleanor Whitfield, true owner of the $800 billion Whitfield Fashion Group, architect of her own sovereignty, and the most quietly powerful woman in a building full of people who had spent the morning learning what power actually looks like, did not look back. The moral of the story: true power never needs an audience, but arrogance always builds one for it. The woman they overlooked was the woman who owned everything, and the silence they mistook for weakness was the patience of someone who had already won. What you have just witnessed is this: dignity is not diminished by those who fail to see it. It simply waits, with the quiet, absolute certainty of an empire, for the moment the truth can no longer be contained. Dear viewers, Eleanor's story teaches us three of the most powerful lessons any of us can carry. That silence is not weakness. It is sometimes the most sophisticated strategy available to a person of genuine power. That arrogance is always blind. It sees what it wants to see, dismisses what it cannot categorize, and builds, without knowing it, the very stage on which it will be exposed. And that your value does not require anyone's validation to be real. Not a husband's, not a father-in-law's, not a mistress's borrowed confidence. Eleanor never stopped being the owner of an $800 billion empire simply because the people around her stopped looking. The empire did not shrink because they refused to see it, and neither did she. Now I want to hear from you. Drop in the comments the most powerful lesson this story taught you, and tell me honestly, what would you have done differently if you were Eleanor? Would you have revealed the truth sooner? Would you have been able to maintain that silence? I want to read every single answer. And if this story moved you, challenged you, or taught you something you will carry beyond this screen, subscribe now, because stories like Eleanor's, powerful, real, and deeply human, are what we build here every single week. You deserve every one of them.